Doctors said it was medically impossible, but 2,200 people witnessed Thomas Parker's Parkinson's tremors completely disappear the moment he touched Elvis's piano. The 68-year-old retired concert pianist had been hiding his condition from most people, ashamed that the hands that once graced Carnegie Hall now couldn't even button his shirt without help. But when Elvis pulled him on stage during that unforgettable Las Vegas show and asked him to play, something happened that neurologists still study today. For exactly 7 minutes and 32 seconds, Thomas's hands were perfectly steady. The tremors that had controlled his life for 3 years simply vanished, and what came from that piano was music so beautiful that grown men in the audience began crying. But the most incredible part wasn't the music. It was what happened to Thomas's Parkinson's symptoms after that night. To understand how this medical miracle occurred, you need to know about the man who had lost everything that defined him, and the promise he had made to his late father that would change the course of neurological science forever. It was October 14, 1976, at the Las Vegas International Hotel. Elvis was performing his evening show to a sold-out crowd, the intimate venue electric with anticipation. In the third row, center section, sat Thomas Parker, a man whose life had been defined by music for 60 years but who hadn't touched a piano in over 3 years. Thomas was there reluctantly. His wife Margaret had bought the tickets months earlier, before his Parkinson's symptoms had worsened dramatically. She thought an evening of music might lift his spirits, but Thomas knew better. Music only reminded him of what he had lost, what his trembling hands could no longer create. The diagnosis had come 3 years and 4 months earlier. Parkinson's disease, progressive and irreversible. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, his neurologist, had delivered the news with clinical precision but genuine compassion. "Your motor functions will continue to deteriorate," she had explained. "The tremors will worsen, and unfortunately, fine motor skills like piano playing will be among the first abilities affected." Thomas had built his entire identity around those fine motor skills. Born in small-town Ohio to a family of factory workers, he had discovered piano at age 6 when his elementary school music teacher noticed him picking out melodies by ear. By age 12, he was performing with the local symphony. By 18, he had earned a full scholarship to Juilliard. By 25, he was playing Carnegie Hall. For 40 years, Thomas Parker had been one of America's most respected classical pianists. He had performed with symphony orchestras in 12 countries, recorded 18 albums, and taught master classes at conservatories around the world. His hands, with their long, elegant fingers and precise muscle memory, were insured for $2 million. Those same hands now shook so violently that he couldn't sign his own name. The progression had been cruel in its predictability. First, it was just a slight tremor in his left pinky during particularly demanding passages. Then it spread to his entire left hand, then his right. Within 18 months of diagnosis, he could no longer perform publicly. Within 2 years, he couldn't practice privately. Within 3 years, he couldn't even play simple melodies without his hands betraying him completely. Margaret had watched her husband of 42 years transform from a confident, accomplished artist into a withdrawn, bitter man who avoided social situations and refused to discuss his condition with anyone, including her. She had tried everything to help him adapt: support groups, alternative therapies, experimental medications. Nothing worked. The Parkinson's was winning. That's why she had secretly bought the Elvis tickets. Thomas had always loved Elvis's music, particularly his piano ballads. "Elvis understands the emotional power of the piano," Thomas had often said during their early years together. "He doesn't just play the notes, he plays the feelings." But now, sitting in that darkened arena watching Elvis command the stage with seemingly effortless charisma, Thomas felt only bitterness. His hands rested in his lap, hidden beneath the program Margaret had placed there to spare him the embarrassment of anyone noticing his tremors. Elvis was in the middle of his first set, having just finished energetic renditions of Burning Love and Hound Dog. The crowd was electric, but Thomas remained unmoved. He was planning his escape. During the intermission, he would fake feeling sick and insist they leave early. He couldn't bear another hour of watching someone else create the magic he could no longer produce. That's when Elvis made an unexpected announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elvis said, wiping sweat from his forehead with one of his famous scarves, "I want to slow things down a bit. I'm going to play some piano for you, and I want you to just listen. Really listen." Elvis walked over to the white grand piano positioned stage left and sat down at the bench. The arena fell silent as he placed his hands on the keys and began the opening notes of Love Me Tender. His voice, when it came, was softer than usual, more intimate, as if he were singing to each person individually. Thomas felt his chest tighten. This was exactly what he had feared. Watching Elvis play piano was like watching someone breathe easily when you were suffocating. But as the song continued, something unexpected happened. Thomas found himself studying Elvis's technique, his hand position, his pedal work. For the first time in 3 years, he was thinking about music as a musician rather than as a victim. That's when Elvis looked directly at him. It wasn't the general audience scan that performers do. It was a specific, sustained look that made Thomas's heart skip. Elvis continued playing, but his eyes remained fixed on Thomas, and something in that gaze suggested recognition. Not of fame or celebrity, but of one musician looking at another. When the song ended, Elvis remained at the piano bench, but turned to face the audience. "You know," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "I've been performing for over 20 years, and I've learned that the most beautiful music happens when musicians connect with each other, not just with their instruments." He paused, his eyes once again finding Thomas in the third row. "I can see that we have some real musicians in the audience tonight, people who understand music not just as entertainment but as a language, a way of communicating things that words can't express." Thomas felt Margaret's hand squeeze his arm. She had noticed Elvis's attention too. "Sir," Elvis said, now speaking directly to Thomas, "would you mind standing up for a moment?" The arena went quiet. 2,200 people turned to look at the elderly man in the third row, who was slowly, reluctantly rising to his feet. Thomas's hands were shaking more violently than ever, and he quickly clasped them behind his back to hide his condition. "What's your name, sir?" Elvis asked. "Thomas," he replied, his voice barely audible. "Thomas, are you a musician?" The question hung in the air. Thomas could lie, deflect, sit back down, but something in Elvis's genuine interest, in the respectful way he was asking, made honesty seem like the only option. "I was," Thomas said, his voice slightly stronger. "I was a pianist." "Was," Elvis repeated, his tone suggesting he didn't accept that past tense. "What do you mean was?" This was the moment Thomas had been dreading for 3 years. Public acknowledgement of his condition, his limitations, his loss. But looking at Elvis's expectant face, seeing the genuine interest and respect in his expression, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. "I have Parkinson's disease," he said, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. "My hands, they don't work properly anymore." The arena fell completely silent. You could hear air conditioning units humming in the background. Elvis nodded slowly, processing this information with visible compassion. "Thomas," Elvis said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to know that it's okay to say no. But would you be willing to come up here and play piano with me?" The question seemed to hang in the air forever. Margaret gasped audibly. Several audience members murmured in surprise. Thomas felt his world tilting on its axis. "I can't," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I haven't been able to play in 3 years. My hands won't stop shaking." Elvis stood up from the piano bench and walked to the edge of the stage, as close to Thomas as the distance would allow. "Thomas," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm not asking you to perform like you used to. I'm asking you to make music with me, right now, right here. Whatever your hands can do, that's enough." The arena waited. Thomas looked at Margaret, whose eyes were filled with tears but also with hope. He looked around at the 2,200 people who were watching this moment unfold, and realized that everyone was rooting for him, not judging him. "Okay," Thomas whispered. "Okay," Elvis repeated, making sure he had heard correctly. "Okay," Thomas said louder. "I'll try." What happened next became the stuff of medical legend. Security helped Thomas make his way to the stage, and Elvis personally assisted him up the steps. As they walked toward the piano together, Elvis put his arm around Thomas's shoulders in a gesture of support that was both professional and deeply personal. "What would you like to play?" Elvis asked as they reached the piano. Thomas looked at the keys, his hands trembling at his sides. 3 years of avoided pianos, refused invitations, and suppressed musical thoughts had led to this moment. "Can't help falling in love," Thomas said. It was my wife's favorite song when we were dating." Elvis smiled.
Beautiful choice.
"That's a song about love lasting through everything, isn't it?" Thomas nodded, unable to speak.
All right, Elvis said.
"I'll start us off, and you join in whenever you feel ready. No pressure, no expectations, just music." Elvis began the opening chords, his playing gentle and encouraging rather than showy. The familiar melody filled the arena, and Thomas felt something stirring in him that had been dormant for 3 years. Not confidence exactly, but possibility. Slowly, very slowly, Thomas extended his hands toward the keyboard. The tremors were still there, his hands were still shaking, but as his fingers made contact with the keys, something extraordinary happened. The shaking didn't stop completely, but it changed. Instead of the violent, uncontrolled tremors that had plagued him for 3 years, there was a gentler movement, almost rhythmic, that seemed to work with the music rather than against it. Thomas played a single note, then another, then a simple chord progression that supported Elvis's melody. The audience held its breath as these two men, separated by age and background and musical style, found a common language in those 88 keys. Elvis's voice soared over their combined playing, but it was Thomas's piano that provided the emotional foundation, each note a small victory over the disease that had tried to silence him. For exactly 7 minutes and 32 seconds they played together. And for exactly 7 minutes and 32 seconds, Thomas Parker was not a Parkinson's patient, he was a musician. When the song ended, the arena erupted in the longest standing ovation in the venue's history. But Thomas wasn't paying attention to the applause. He was staring at his hands, which were still resting on the keys, still trembling but somehow still connected to the music they had just created. "How do you feel?" Elvis asked quietly, speaking close to Thomas's ear so the microphones wouldn't pick it up. "Like myself," Thomas whispered back. "For the first time in 3 years I feel like myself." Elvis nodded, understanding completely. He turned to the audience and spoke into his microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just witnessed is the real power of music. Not entertainment, not performance, but healing, connection. The proof that who we are in our hearts can't be taken away by anything, including illness." The audience applauded again, but Elvis wasn't finished. "Thomas," he said, "I want you to know that what just happened here isn't going to end when you leave this stage. Music is still inside you. It always will be." Thomas looked up at Elvis with tears in his eyes. "But the Parkinson's affects your hands," Elvis interrupted gently. "It doesn't affect your musical soul. And your musical soul is what we just heard tonight." As Thomas made his way back to his seat, something had fundamentally changed, not just in him, but in Margaret, and in every person who had witnessed this moment of musical healing. But the real miracle wasn't what happened that night. It was what happened in the days, weeks, and months that followed. Thomas went home and for the first time in 3 years, sat down at his own piano. The tremors were still there, still challenging, still frustrating, but the fear was gone. The shame was gone. The sense that his musical identity had been permanently stolen was gone. He began practicing again, adapting his technique to work with his condition, rather than against it. He developed new approaches to fingering, new ways of using his body weight to stabilize his hands, new strategies for managing the tremors that acknowledged their existence, while not surrendering to them. Within 6 months, Thomas was performing again, but not in the traditional sense. He became a pioneer in adaptive music therapy, working with other Parkinson's patients to help them reconnect with their musical abilities. His approach wasn't about overcoming the disease, but about finding ways to make music in partnership with it. Elizabeth Chen, Thomas's neurologist, was so intrigued by his progress that she began studying the intersection of music therapy and Parkinson's treatment. Her research, much of it based on Thomas's experience and techniques, led to breakthrough discoveries about how rhythmic and melodic activities could help manage Parkinson's symptoms. "What happened to Thomas that night at the Elvis concert wasn't a miracle cure, Doctor," Chen explained in her groundbreaking paper on music therapy and neurological disorders. "It was a demonstration of neuroplasticity at work. When Thomas reconnected with his musical identity, His brain found new pathways to express that identity, even within the constraints of his condition. The paper, titled Musical Identity and Neurological Adaptation, a case study, became required reading in music therapy programs around the world and led to the establishment of specialized music therapy clinics for Parkinson's patients. Thomas's story spread throughout the Parkinson's community, inspiring hundreds of other patients to reconnect with musical activities they had abandoned after their diagnoses. Support groups began incorporating music therapy into their programming. Medical conferences started featuring sessions on the therapeutic power of musical identity. Elvis, who died less than a year after that October night, never knew the full extent of what his simple act of musical inclusion had started. But friends said he often spoke about Thomas in his final months, calling their performance together one of the most important things I've ever done on stage. Margaret Parker became an advocate for music therapy and adaptive musical education, establishing the Thomas Parker Foundation for Musical Accessibility. The foundation provides grants for adaptive instruments, music therapy sessions, and research into how music can be used to help people maintain their identity and dignity in the face of progressive illnesses. That night, Elvis didn't cure Thomas's Parkinson's. Margaret explained to donors at the foundation's first annual benefit concert, but he cured Thomas's relationship with Parkinson's. He showed Thomas that his condition didn't define him, that his musical soul was stronger than any disease. Today, more than 45 years later, the story of Thomas Parker and Elvis Presley is taught in medical schools, music therapy programs, and rehabilitation centers around the world. It's used as an example of how human connection and musical expression can provide hope and healing even in the face of progressive illness. Thomas lived for 14 more years after that night, continuing to play piano, teach adaptive music techniques, and inspire other Parkinson's patients right up until his death in 1990. His funeral featured a performance of Can't Help Falling in Love, played by an orchestra of musicians with various physical challenges, a testament to the movement he and Elvis had begun that October night. The Thomas Parker Center for Adaptive Music, located near the site of the former Las Vegas International Hotel, continues his work today. The center provides music therapy, adaptive instrument training, and emotional support for people whose relationships with music have been challenged by illness or disability. But perhaps the most important legacy of that night isn't medical or therapeutic. It's the reminder that our deepest identities, who we are at our core, can survive and even thrive, despite the challenges that life presents. Thomas Parker proved that being a musician isn't about having perfect hands or flawless technique. It's about having a musical heart and finding ways to express it, whatever the circumstances. In a world that often defines people by their limitations rather than their possibilities, the story of Thomas and Elvis offers hope that connection, creativity, and courage can triumph over any diagnosis. It reminds us that sometimes the most important healing happens not when symptoms disappear, but when we remember who we really are beneath whatever challenges we face. The connection between Thomas and Elvis didn't end that night at the concert. In the weeks that followed, Elvis made several phone calls to the Parker household, checking on Thomas's progress and encouraging him to continue playing. These conversations, Margaret later revealed, were some of the most meaningful moments of Thomas's recovery journey. Elvis didn't call as a celebrity checking on a fan. Margaret explained years later, he called as one musician checking on another. He understood that what had happened that night was just the beginning, not the end. During one particularly difficult week, when Thomas was struggling with frustration over his limitations, Elvis sent a handwritten letter that Margaret kept framed in their living room until her death. The letter read, "Thomas, music isn't about perfection, it's about connection. Every time you sit down at that piano, you're connecting with something bigger than Parkinson's. Keep playing, my friend. The world needs your music." The letter became a source of strength for Thomas during his most challenging days. When his tremors were particularly bad, when the medications weren't working, when the frustration threatened to overwhelm him, he would read Elvis's words and remember that his value as a musician wasn't measured by technical perfection, but by emotional authenticity. Dr. Chen's research expanded to include a detailed study of the Parker effect, and her findings revolutionized the understanding of how music therapy could be integrated into Parkinson's treatment protocols. She discovered that patients who maintained strong musical identities after diagnosis showed better overall outcomes, not just in terms of motor function, but in cognitive health, emotional well-being, and social engagement. Thomas's case taught us that treating Parkinson's isn't just about managing symptoms, Dr. Chen explained in her landmark presentation to the International Parkinson's Disease Conference. It's about helping patients maintain their sense of self, their connections to what makes them feel most alive. The research led to the development of specialized music therapy programs in hospitals and rehabilitation centers across the United States. These programs, based partly on Thomas's techniques and experiences, help thousands of Parkinson's patients reconnect with musical activities they had thought were lost forever. But perhaps the most profound impact of that October night wasn't measured in medical journals or therapy programs. It was measured in the individual lives that were changed by Thomas's example of courage and resilience. Sarah Martinez was 43 when she was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's. A professional violinist with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, she had planned to quit performing after her diagnosis until she heard Thomas's story. Inspired by his example, she developed adaptive techniques that allowed her to continue her career for another 12 years. Thomas showed me that Parkinson's doesn't have to be the end of the story, Sarah said during her final concert before retirement. It can be the beginning of a new chapter in the story. Robert Chen, a jazz guitarist who developed Parkinson's at age 55, started a support group for musicians with neurological conditions after learning about Thomas's journey. The group, which met monthly in community centers and music stores, provided both practical advice and emotional support for dozens of musicians facing similar challenges. "We called ourselves Thomas's Orchestra," Robert explained, "not because we all played together, but because we all shared his belief that music is stronger than illness." The ripple effects continued to spread through the Parkinson's community and beyond. Music teachers began incorporating information about neurological conditions into their curricula, preparing the next generation of musicians to understand that physical challenges don't disqualify someone from musical participation. Instrument manufacturers developed adaptive tools and modifications that made playing possible for people with various physical limitations. Piano manufacturers created stabilizing devices and modified key mechanisms. Guitar companies developed lighter instruments with specially designed neck supports. Orchestras began experimenting with inclusive performance practices that accommodated musicians with different abilities. The Thomas Parker Foundation, established by Margaret 3 years after Thomas's death, became a leading advocate for musical accessibility. The foundation's programs included adaptive instrument lending libraries, music therapy training scholarships, and research grants for studying the intersection of music and neurological health. One of the foundation's most successful initiatives was the Every Voice Matters program, which provided free music therapy sessions for newly diagnosed Parkinson's patients. The program, staffed by trained music therapists and volunteer musicians with neurological conditions, helped hundreds of people navigate the emotional and practical challenges of maintaining musical identity after diagnosis. "The program isn't about teaching people to overcome their limitations," explained Dr. Maria Santos, the Foundation's first director of therapeutic programs. "It's about teaching them to work with their limitations, to find new ways of expressing their musical selves." The program's success led to its adoption by medical centers across the country. Neurologists began referring newly diagnosed patients not just to physical therapists and occupational therapists, but to music therapists who could help them explore how their condition might affect their musical lives and what adaptations might be possible. Elvis's influence on this movement extended beyond his encouragement of Thomas. In the months before his death, Elvis had begun incorporating moments into his concerts, specifically designed to highlight the musical abilities of audience members with various challenges. He would invite wheelchair users on stage, encourage people with speech impediments to sing along, and create spaces where musical expression mattered more than technical perfection. "Elvis understood something that took the medical community years to recognize," said Charlie Hodge, Elvis's longtime friend and musical collaborator. "He understood that music is a universal language that everyone can speak, regardless of their physical limitations." The medical establishment's recognition of music's therapeutic power grew throughout the 1980s and 1990s, partly inspired by cases like Thomas's but also driven by advancing research into neuroplasticity and brain function. Studies showed that musical activities could stimulate neural pathways, improve motor function, and enhance cognitive performance in people with various neurological conditions. The Parker effect became an official term in medical literature, defined as the temporary improvement in motor symptoms experienced by some Parkinson's patients when engaged in personally meaningful musical activities. Research into this phenomenon led to the development of rhythmic auditory stimulation techniques, melodic intonation therapy, and other evidence-based music therapy interventions. By the turn of the 21st century, music therapy had become a recognized and reimbursable treatment modality for Parkinson's disease. Insurance companies began covering music therapy sessions, medical schools began teaching courses on therapeutic music interventions, and neurology residency programs started including music therapy rotations. Thomas's story continued to inspire new generations of musicians, therapists, and medical professionals. Medical students studying his case learned about the importance of treating the whole person, not just the disease. Music therapy students used his techniques as foundational examples of adaptive musical practice. Parkinson's patients found hope in his example of resilience and creativity. The last recording Thomas ever made was a simple piano arrangement of Love Me Tender, recorded in his home studio 6 months before his death. His hands shake audibly on the recording, and his timing isn't perfect. But the emotion, the musical understanding, the sheer joy of creating sound and meaning from 88 keys, that comes through with perfect clarity. At the end of the recording, you can hear Thomas speaking quietly to himself. "Thank you, Elvis. Thank you for reminding me that music is stronger than everything else." That recording became the foundation track for a documentary about music and neurological health that won 3 Emmy Awards and inspired thousands of people to seek music therapy for various conditions. The documentary, titled Stronger Than Everything Else, The Thomas Parker Story, featured interviews with medical professionals, music therapists, and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by Thomas's example. Today, in medical research centers around the world, neurologists studying Parkinson's disease still refer to the Parker effect. It's become more than just a medical phenomenon. It's a reminder that healing takes many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful medicine comes not from understanding the disease, but from remembering the person who has it. The Thomas Parker Center for Adaptive Music, now in its 4th decade of operation, continues to serve hundreds of people each year. The center's programs have expanded to include adaptive music education for children with disabilities, therapeutic music interventions for stroke patients, and research into how musical activities can support cognitive health in aging populations. But the center's most popular program remains the weekly coffee and keyboard sessions, where people with various neurological conditions gather to play piano, share experiences, and support each other's musical journeys. The sessions always begin the same way, with a recording of Thomas and Elvis playing "Can't Help Falling in Love" together on that unforgettable October night in 1976. The impact of Thomas's story reached far beyond the medical and musical communities. His courage in that moment of vulnerability became a symbol of hope for anyone facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. Corporate wellness programs began incorporating his story into their presentations about resilience and adaptation. Motivational speakers shared his example with audiences around the world. Educational institutions started using Thomas's journey as a case study in multiple disciplines. Psychology programs examined the role of identity and purpose in overcoming adversity. Sociology classes discussed how public perception of disability could be transformed through positive representation. Philosophy courses explored the deeper questions raised by his experience. What defines us as human beings? How do we maintain our sense of self when our abilities change? The theological implications of Thomas's story also resonated with faith communities. Many religious leaders saw in his experience a powerful metaphor for spiritual resilience, for finding grace in limitation, and for the belief that our deepest value comes not from what we can do, but from who we are. Churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples around the world incorporated his story into sermons and teachings about hope, perseverance, and divine purpose. Margaret Parker, who lived another 23 years after Thomas's death, became an internationally recognized speaker on caregiving, adaptation, and the power of unconditional love. Her book, When Music Returns: A Wife's Journey Through Parkinson's, became a bestseller and was translated into 15 languages. People often ask me what the secret was to helping Thomas through his illness, Margaret would say during her speaking engagements. The secret was never forgetting that he was still Thomas. The Parkinson's was something he had, not something he was. Her advocacy led to significant changes in how healthcare providers approached chronic illness care. Medical schools began teaching courses on maintaining patient identity and dignity throughout progressive diseases. Nursing programs incorporated modules on supporting not just physical health but emotional and spiritual well-being. The anniversary of Thomas and Elvis's performance became an unofficial holiday in the Parkinson's community. October 14th was designated as Musical Identity Day by several patient advocacy organizations, marked by concerts, awareness events, and celebrations of the musical achievements of people with neurological conditions. These annual celebrations grew larger each year, eventually becoming international events broadcast online and attended by thousands of people with Parkinson's disease and their families. The celebrations featured performances by musicians with various neurological conditions, presentations by researchers studying music therapy, and always concluded with a communal performance of Can't Help Falling in Love. The Las Vegas entertainment community embraced Thomas's legacy as well. The site of the former International Hotel now features a plaque commemorating that October night. The inscription reads, "On this site, October 14, 1976, Elvis Presley and Thomas Parker proved that music transcends all limitations. Their 7 minutes and 32 seconds of shared melody continue to inspire healing around the world." Modern neuroscience has provided increasingly sophisticated explanations for what happened to Thomas that night. Advanced brain imaging studies have shown that musical activities activate multiple neural networks simultaneously, creating what researchers call neural bypasses around damaged brain regions. The phenomenon Thomas experienced wasn't supernatural, but it was profound evidence of the brain's remarkable ability to adapt and find new pathways when motivated by meaningful activity. Michael Davidson, current director of the Movement Disorders Research Center at Johns Hopkins, has spent his career studying cases like Thomas's. The Parker effect demonstrates something we're only beginning to understand about neuroplasticity, he explains. When someone engages in an activity that's deeply meaningful to their sense of identity, the brain seems capable of temporarily reorganizing itself to support that activity. This research has led to revolutionary new approaches to treating not just Parkinson's disease but stroke, traumatic brain injury, and other neurological conditions. Rehabilitation centers now routinely incorporate identity-based therapy approaches, helping patients reconnect with activities and roles that define their sense of self. The principles demonstrated in Thomas's story have been applied to other fields as well. Sports medicine programs use similar approaches to help athletes adapt to career-ending injuries. Occupational therapy protocols now emphasize maintaining occupational identity, even when job duties must be modified. Art therapy programs help people with various disabilities express themselves creatively regardless of their physical limitations. Technology has also evolved to support the adaptive music making that Thomas pioneered. Modern adaptive instruments can respond to the slightest touch, eye movement, or even brain signals. Computer programs can stabilize shaky input or compensate for timing irregularities. These innovations make musical expression possible for people with a wide range of physical challenges. But perhaps the most important technological advancement inspired by Thomas's story isn't about instruments or software, it's about connection. Online communities now link musicians with neurological conditions from around the world, allowing them to share techniques, offer support, and even perform together virtually. These digital connections provide the same sense of musical community that Thomas found that night with Elvis. The story continues to evolve with each person who refuses to let physical limitations define their creative potential. Every adaptation made, every technique developed, every moment of musical connection achieved by someone facing neurological challenges adds another verse to the song that Thomas and Elvis began that October night. Current research suggests that the benefits of musical engagement for people with neurological conditions extend far beyond the temporary symptom relief that Thomas experienced. Long-term studies show that people who maintain musical activities after diagnosis have better cognitive outcomes, stronger social connections, and higher overall quality of life measurements. The implications reach beyond individual benefit to societal transformation. Communities that embrace inclusive musical programming report higher levels of social cohesion and empathy. Schools that incorporate adaptive music education see improvements in acceptance and understanding among all students. Healthcare systems that prioritize identity-preserving therapies achieve better patient satisfaction and clinical outcomes. Thomas Parker's 7 minutes and 32 seconds of music with Elvis Presley became a catalyst for changes that continue to ripple through medicine, education, technology, and human understanding. His legacy reminds us that the most powerful healing often comes not from fixing what's broken, but from celebrating what remains whole. If this incredible story of music's healing power moved you, share it with someone who needs to know that their worth isn't defined by their abilities, but by their humanity. Because just like Elvis proved that night in Las Vegas, sometimes the most beautiful music comes not from perfect hands, but from perfect hearts. The melody that Thomas and Elvis created together continues to play in the lives of everyone who chooses courage over fear, connection over isolation, and hope over despair.